Welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival, the 3-week-long online festival of ideas that explores the question, what if we could redesign everything? Today I'm going to be joined by Trebor Scholz, professor at New School in New York City, who says that an alternative model of ownership is possible, and that models like Uber are not inevitable. Even though this is a pre-recorded session, we're still really keen to get your feedback, your comments and your questions. And the best places to do that are either in the comment section just below where you're watching this video, or by joining the conversation on social media at #ThinkDiff. So thanks so much for being with us today, Trebor. And today we're going to be digging into the topic of the sharing economy and your theory of platform cooperativism. See if I can say that before the end of this interview. I wanted to start off, there's a lot of very public critiques of models like Uber, like Airbnb, but there's something very interesting you wrote that I wanted to start off with, which was that the backlash against unethical labour practices in the collaborative sharing economy has been overplayed. What do you mean by that?
Well, Seth, thank you for having me. It's great to have this discussion, and I hope we will get to a vigorous debate about these issues. So, yeah, on the one hand, we need to acknowledge that very many people actually really enjoy this extractive sharing economy. They enjoy the convenience of these taxi rides with Uber. They enjoy the extra income from Airbnb. So there's a definite intervention there, and I think you can't just sort of go over that, right? You can't ignore that. On the other hand, there's a whole body of literature now, right, that basically frames this critique of the sharing economy based on monopoly, right, privacy invasions, and just imagine when you get up in the morning and you pour a cup of coffee and you go online. Basically, chances are that all of us are really just on 4 or 5 platforms. And consider then how little influence we have over the governance about what happens on those platforms. So while we rely on these platforms for our everyday existence, we have hardly any say in the way they are run. So I think this is one key point. Then, I don't know if I really need to rehearse the whole critique of the Uber model, right? Not just the company, but the model has, of course, beyond the misogynistic work culture, also been about basically, creating this worldwide monopoly in transportation, which basically, runs on this sort of very unethical labor practices.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Trevor. And I think there's something that's become very familiar about these models of Uber. There's almost a reproduction in cities around the world of what the Uber for this or the Uber for that, and that's become quite entrenched as this is the way in which these platforms can operate. Is it inevitable that these models are going to continue growing and expanding, in your view?
Well, Seb, I think first we need to sort of take a step back and really think about this not just in terms of the internet. These things are never isolated. So I think what we are seeing is really, over the past 40 years, a shift of labor markets to the internet. And with that, you see a shift away from direct employment, which I don't know how this plays out in the UK, but in the US and in other parts of Europe, basically about 1/3 of this freelance population is doing quite well. They make perhaps even more money than they would in direct employment. But for 2/3, this is not playing out well. They are dissatisfied with that situation, right? And I think that this sharing economy on the heels of the 2008 financial crisis really basically shifted labor relations in a way where it is easier to extract value from workers, where it is easier to implement unethical work relations. In the sense that, just think about crowdsourcing sites like Amazon Mechanical Turk, which I would count into this ecosystem, where novice workers made $2 to $3 an hour. So that really wasn't possible on that scale in real time before, right? So on that scale in real time, I mean, exploitation, of course, is much older than that, but you have basically like a shift in scale, and I think that's I think an important thing to mention. And then you had initially coming out in 2008 these are basically thriving on this financial crisis, quite genuine sharing sites, right? Like BlaBlaCar or Couchsurfing initially. So I think there was a very genuine impetus of mutual aid and solidarity and resource sharing and all of these ideals that were claimed by Rachel Bartzman in her early work. But then this was sort of changed, right, into and taken over by these more extractive models. And I think this is what we see today.
And just to clarify, what do you see as the sort of key differences between, say, BlaBlaCar and Uber? How do you recognize those different models?
Right. Well, I mean, initially, BlaBlaCar basically was really about ride sharing, right? Where the Uber model was about creating a taxi business, right? So then we can talk about this whole obfuscation of language, the language that is used by many of these companies that talk about counterculture and really mobilize this language of the 70s, of sharing, and they really mobilize the social capital of the peer-to-peer culture to sell products, right? To basically sell a service. So it's really sort of hijacking that social capital. And so the difference clearly with Couchsurfing and BlaBlaCar as it originated was that those were not extractive services. They were really about genuine sharing.
Actually, we've had previously on the Disruptive Innovation Festival, Michel Bowens, that you may be familiar with his work or even familiar with him. And I think he said there's a sort of value crisis within the sort of sharing economy sector, or people involved in the sharing economy, where algorithms are increasingly controlling markets and platforms are sort of atomizing people as individuals. And so, I mean, I think I've seen you talk about this and write about this before. What sort of makes this time now so important as we look to steer this, I guess, this sector as an opportunity?
I mean, so you just pointed out, just quickly to that as well, which this restructuring of labor markets, as I described, has, of course, also changed the role of unions. So it makes it much more difficult for traditional labor unions to function because they cannot represent the large body of workers to a single owner, because that is just not the situation of, in the United States, 65 million workers, right? So 1 in 3 Americans is a freelancer. So for all of these workers, they can't be represented in this way because they are, first of all, geographically distributed. Second of all, they are working with 3, 4, 5, maybe 10 employers per year or more. So it basically needs a real rethinking of this, how you can advocate for workers as well. And I think if you really substantially want to change something, really ownership is needed. So I think this was my original intervention in 2014, when I basically said, after having worked on digital labor since 2008, and really thought about critique of that for a very long time and published on that, that there has to be this sort of breakthrough where we think about how workers and users can, and all stakeholders in this ecosystem can basically co-own these platforms that they are so dependent on. This is the platforms where they make their livelihood. This is where they spend so much of their time. This is where they socialize. This is where much of that happens.
That's interesting. And I mean, obviously, whenever we start talking about ownership in society and shifting the models around ownership, people start thinking we're talking about maybe overhauling the entire economic system, I've actually seen you write before that you think that a different model of ownership for sharing economy could quite easily exist in coexistence with our markets today. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So I think I think this is about. I see platform cooperativism. I see platform cooperatives, by which I mean platforms that are democratically governed and owned. So let's think an Uber-like platform owned by its drivers. Right? This is what, just in a short sentence, would define as a platform for us. That those basically can cut out a niche in the market, right? And this is, I mean, it's not, I don't see this model taking over the entire market for transportation, the entire market for home services. And I don't, because there is, historically, you see that this is not how cooperatives work, right? We have not seen in the last 200 years cooperatives taking over the economy, right? What we have seen is that they have an absolute solid place within it, right? Where in the United States, 1 million jobs is created through cooperatives, and there are gigantic businesses like REI Corp, Ocean Spray, or Ace Hardware that are very familiar to Americans, but they are not thinking of them as cooperatives. And so I think that it's a business model that is basically on the way to the things that Paul Mason talks about and many others of a sort of post-capitalist society, that this could be a step on the way there, right? So like a concrete near-term alternative, which I think is precisely what is often missing when people are talking about alternatives. It's they are not really addressing what you can do next Thursday, right? So we are dreaming of a world of universal basic income, a post-gender world in which wages are detached from life opportunities, and I'm fully in support of all that. But how do you get there? What will you do next Thursday, right? And so I think to have these temporary, by all means, partial alternatives is important because it gives people something to do in the meantime. So it's and I think what we do have to think about is how to move these platform co-ops out of a sort of reformist thinking, right? So how can they really be radical alternatives? How can they be what Andre Gortz called non-reformist reforms, right? So in the sense that they really change power relations, that they really bring about social change, and not just for a small number of people in an institution like a cooperative, but really beyond that, right? So Gortz gives universal basic income as an example of that, which is situated well within capitalism, but significantly changes power relations. So how could platform co-ops achieve some similar effect? Would be a question that I think would be directed at this ecosystem. And how can we think about contributing to the commons while also changing the lives of the workers within the co-op, of course, but also projecting outward?
For those listening in, that Paul Mason, that theory of post-capitalism, he spoke at the DIF last year, and indeed his basic hypothesis is there's a load of activity that exists beyond the traditional private public sector markets, enabled by this new phenomena of information. And he cites examples like Wikipedia, which I guess would also fit into what you're saying as a model of cooperatives that exist outside.
Yeah. So, when you think about, I don't know, like Karl Polanyi, for example, right, the Great Transformation, how he basically describes how this idea of a market economy was introduced, and was not this sort of trans-historical, always existing system, but is actually something that was introduced and that also had to basically, people's minds had to be changed. There had to be different habits of mind that basically bring this self-interested, this what they always refer to as a homo economicus, right? This basically the self-interested attacker, right? The competitor as a model, right, onto the scene, when before there was, a barter economy, and if you like, a type of peer-to-peer economy. So it's important to realize that what we have now hasn't always existed and is not trans-historical and will always be like that. And the question is, so yeah, how can we get back to more of this barter economy? And also linking this to what we talked about before, how can cooperatives and unions work together to find a new, to reinvent themselves, right? Because I think we see, again, like over the last, 40 years, slowly a re-emergence, a renaissance of cooperatives. Right? So there is a clear, re-energizing of this model. And so how can they rethink themselves in this context?
And at the diff this year, we're talking a lot about 21st century economics as a key theme of the event. And I think one of the key positives of that is this idea that economics is not a religion. It's not something that's invented in a moment of time and that's it. It's something that's ever changing and should be up for debate and discussion. I find the cooperatives discussion really interesting as well. And I think just to take that back a little bit for any viewers who may not be familiar with co-ops, I mean, you mentioned that there's some absolutely enormous cooperatives that people probably don't think of in that way. They just exist in the model. Would you give us a quick definition, a quick 30-second definition of what a cooperative actually is versus a traditional business?
Well, there are the 7 cooperative principles, right? So, I mean, I don't want to go into every last detail, but I think the most important thing is governance, right? So, I mean, in the principles, they start out with that membership is voluntary, right? Which basically distinguishes it from socialist cooperatives, right? So in socialist countries, you had compulsory co-op membership, which is basically trying to distinguish itself from that. But you have democratic governance, so one worker, one vote, and just collective ownership, right? Let's just anchor it in that. I think these are the most important things. That the core intellectual commitments are in that. And they are really something that we also have to really be, keep an eye on when we look at these online platforms. And what can that mean, right? How can we, what does that mean when there is, let's say, a platform that is governed by a blockchain algorithm? How could that be democratically governed? And so people actually find responses to that, like where they start, like one cooperative in Berlin, artchain.coop. They start with the one worker, one vote principle, thinking about the algorithm. So basically they vote on the algorithm. Right? They vote on the functionality of the algorithm in the co-op way.
And actually that sort of begins to answer my next question. You mentioned a bit about platform cooperativism. There we go. I've managed to pronounce it at this point in the conversation. And I think thinking about how this quite old concept and way of working translates to a digital is quite interesting, because I guess it's based a little bit on an era of, or originated in an era of unions and people getting together and talking about things. In your work around platform cooperativism, what sort of answers have you come up with in response to that, or what sort of things do you think make maybe that model somewhat unique or different from what we think of as traditional cooperatives?
Well, I think first of all, you have to see that this is not just about cloning Uber or Airbnb, right? So this is not just about saying, oh, let's just take this algorithm and now run it as a cooperative, right? So there are this is really about sort of ripping out this algorithmic heart of these operations, but really then embedding the cooperative values. And you see that with, for example, the platform cooperative Up and Go here in New York City, which is basically a co-op of co-ops. So it's like an umbrella platform for cooperatives to offer their home services. So they are starting with cleaning, and the difference you see quite quickly because the thinking is just so different, right? So they, for example, don't have individual worker profiles, which, you know, it's like that's essential to the extractive sharing economy. To have this sort of possibility to drop a worker, right? If you fall under this rating, you lose your job, and all of that. And they basically say like, well, we are all, we take pride in our cooperative. So basically you hire the cooperative and who will come, you do not know. Right? But these people, in difference to the larger, you know, to Handy or platforms like this, are all vetted already. I mean, they are close to the people in their co-op, right? They are known entities. They are not some sort of faceless workers out in freelancers out in the economy.
I mean, we've talked around. I mean, are there actually one quick question? Are there examples in your view of pure platform cooperatives today in the market?
There are about 200 companies in that ecosystem right now.
Yeah.
I should add to that Up and Go, just to sort of add another distinguishing factor, is currently at least percent of its revenue to operate the platform and giving 95% to the workers. And if you're familiar with other companies, with Uber, this is between 25% in some markets, what they take from drivers. And with TaskRabbit, which is a more comparable company, it's 30%. So Up and Go takes 5%. So these companies emerge in all kinds of markets. So this is important to understand that it's not just in one industry, right? So they are from, you know, there's a patient data cooperative. So basically thinking about how your health data can be cooperatively owned to give you more control over them and perhaps even monetize them to fund public research. You know, taxi companies, there are, you know, childcare cooperatives, there's a health research platform co-op. I mean, so in all kinds of areas. I think the biggest promise is really in social care, because this is where I see the biggest problem. Right? So people are aging, and there is really not a sufficient amount of home healthcare professionals. And to organize people around this platform co-op model, I think is something that's very promising. And in fact, I have a large project where I, together with my collaborators, really build and support platform co-ops, especially in that sector.
That's great. And I mean, the next question, I guess, is a bit of an obvious one, and to some extent. I mean, I was surprised to find out, I think that this is another quote from some of your work, that there's actually more than 200,000 people working in co-ops in the UK alone. You know, there's a huge number of people invested in this, but I suppose the incentives for running a traditional Uber type business that fits into perhaps the traditional form of making money, you know, and justifying shareholder value is quite obvious for a young entrepreneur engaging in that sphere. How do we, or how is it possible to better incentivize actions towards this kind of model, towards a platform cooperative model? Is it policy interventions? Is it you know, information?
I think all of the above, right? I think, and so we talked earlier about the switch to a market society and how that really needed a change of you know, mental habits, or you know, it's really about an attitude as well. Right? And I think what we need is as much creating a counter narrative, right, to these narratives of the extractive sharing economy. And so, and then based on that, it needs. It basically needs, you know, town hall meetings. So this is like if we write running this platform cooperativism consortium, and we write policy briefs sometimes for senators, right? So this is what we suggest them to do, is basically to run town halls and basically inform people about the downsides of that economy, and also the fact that there is actually an alternative. And in fact, there are many alternatives. Platform cooperativism is, of course, only one of them. So there are many other movements that work in the same direction with us. And I think this is important to understand, that this is really part of one social movement working with many others. Right? So you have the peer-to-peer foundation you mentioned with Michelle's work, and which is particularly active in Europe. Then you have the B Corps that are very a good number of them here in the United States. So all of that in tandem, right? The zebra movement. You probably know.
That's an important point, I think. And I mean, is there a sign? I mean, when you look at all those different activities happen, would you say that there's momentum behind? I mean, in the same way that there's obviously momentum in fast-growing pace of business models like Uber and Airbnb, do you see a similar momentum, maybe at a slightly less dramatic scale, behind this kind of movement, or are there big barriers in the way of that?
There are definitely obstacles. I mean, that's clear, right? And I see many, practical utopians, so people who have really strong ideals, but also a keen eye on what to do next. Right? And I mean, I just see an enormous amount of enthusiasm and energy, and I mean, there isn't a week going by with us being approached by some new group that wants to start a platform for. Last week, we were approached by taxi drivers, Uber drivers from Cape Town, South Africa. And so out of the 10,000 Uber drivers in South Africa, 2,000 of them are ready to join the platform for. They started by suing Uber for employee status, but their ultimate goal is starting a platform for. There's a group of 50 independent bookstores in Northern California. They want to start one. Tomorrow or the day after, I will talk to an orchestra from London who wants to start a platform for, right, to offer their services. So this model is really like that. It's very dynamic. Obstacles are largely, initial funding, short of venture capitalist funding. But people are finding solutions for that as well, right? So if you think that there is an advantage in the cooperative model there as well, which is this multi-stakeholder model where people, prospective members of the co-op, are actually, are part of the initial financing of the launch. So, this you had this with Famondo, which is an cooperative online marketplace in Berlin, and now also in the UK, right? Famondo UK exists as well. And so this is how they raise their initial funds. So people are starting to think about it. They start thinking about, we might launch an initial coin offering together with Outlier Ventures for this platform co-op ecosystem. And so, there are many different experiments. I mean, experiments of how to.
That's that Cape Town example. That's amazing. That the 2,000 taxi drivers. I mean, bring that to life for us just a little bit. What does that mean when 2,000 taxi drivers say we want to start a platform co-op? Does that mean they start appointing? They create the governance structure and they need some initial funding for that? How does it actually come into life?
I mean, I think it's very easy to start something like that technically, right? I mean, so now with a platform like ShareTribe, which is an open source company that basically helps people to create online labor markets within a week or two, you can be up and running. So technically, that's not really the issue. It's also not particularly expensive to do that. The issues, I think, are much more in terms of governance. I think this is something that especially worker cooperatives always face, right? So people disagreeing. You have, and this of course becomes even more difficult if workers are distributed. So I think governance issues need to be solved. There are tools like Lumio or liquid democracy that start to address some of these problems, but I think it's not entirely solved as an issue. Then you have, other issues as well. So like you have, leadership issues perhaps need to be addressed. People maybe, with all their idealism, in the end start exploiting themselves, right? So people have to learn to take care of themselves. I think it's a bigger issue than one might think, so that they don't burn out. And stuff like that. But overall, I think these are all things that people are aware of and are working on, and that can be resolved. So I'm very optimistic about it.
I mean, one thing that strikes me about this conversation is that quite a lot of the time we seem to be talking a little bit about sort of relocalization of the economy in some senses. Is that fair to say, or are there examples where platform, the fact that these things can now be run via a digital platform can actually, make them into a global or larger than local initiative? Is that a proposition that would be?
This is what people objecting about this model or having doubts about this model bring up first, which is basically the question of scaling. So part of the success of companies like Uber, part of the economic success is that they are scaling to global operations. I think this is, again, we are not talking about clones. We are not talking about just replicating this model that the extractive sharing economy offers. Instead, I think this also gives a different response to this question of scale. Right? So I think in some cases, it's absolutely needed. So you have if you want to run an online marketplace, you need to run globally. Right? It needs to scale up. In others, it doesn't. Right? So you can absolutely run a stock photography site and work with 1,000 photographers, just as Stocksy, the platform cooperative in Canada, does. Right? So they limit their number of workers to 1,000, and also completely different to the extractive sharing economy, actually invests in those workers. Right? So it's like, okay, so we are committing to you. You are our, you are a co-op member now. So we want you to succeed. So we're going to work with you, and we're going to give seminars and teach you how to create a product that we can then sell, right? That basically meets our standards, something that people are looking for based on our insights. So, and that's also a big difference. So, of course, then people would say, well, this only affects 1,000 workers or producers, whatever you want to call them, artists. Well, you could say that you could replicate this model, right? And I think in any case, like I said before, right, we all have to think about how this model can become non-reformist in the sense of really this sort of outward projections of your value, the outward projection of your intellectual mission, I think is really important to really change power relationships outside of the platform co-op as well. And I think people are doing that by publishing their code base online as open source, as Fairmondo does, as many other projects do. And I think this is a good start.
And I think almost just about out of time with you today, Trevor, but I wanted to, one of the reasons this conversation is very interesting for me is that working here at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation on the concept of the circular economy, we're often talking about this idea of transitioning from the physical selling of products to a service model. So, there's a classic example of Philips selling light as a service rather than all the light fixings. One of the big criticisms of that model is that, one of the potential pitfalls of that model is, of course, that actually it ends up concentrating resources in an ever smaller number of people's hands. And it's just interesting to think that perhaps this platform cooperativism model, this idea of sharing ownership more broadly, resonates in terms of its development in a period of time with the development of models that perhaps conserve resources, more effectively. And obviously, Uber is the hugest, the biggest example.
Well,
of that.
Exactly, right. So because, like you asked about the sort of core definition of co-ops, and one of the 7 cooperative principles is co-ops help other co-ops. So you have a very different thinking within this ecosystem than within the extractive sharing economy, right? So Uber would never help out Lyft, right? Or they would never share their code, or they would never share their databases. But here, with the whole economy, it's not about competition with each other, but basically about mutual aid. And so how can you create, for example, use peer production licenses to make code available to other cooperatives? How can you use a digital identity, for example, that makes workers more autonomous, more empowered within this economy, because it makes it easier to switch employers. And these things become much more possible if you are based and grounded in an idea, much more Kropotkin than Ayn Rand. Right? So, yeah.
And maybe the final question from me before I let you go is for potential young entrepreneurs, young designers who maybe are intrigued by the potential that this model offers. I mean, I think there's perhaps a new generation of designers who have a different perspective on social and environmental issues than certainly there are different perspectives in the Silicon Valley model potentially. What would be your main message to them? Where should they go maybe to find out more? Where could they start potentially?
Right. Well, the hub for this movement is platform.core, which is where we have resources and information about events and much more. And to those young entrepreneurs, I would say, or young developers and people who just want to contribute, I think what we can't offer is free food, right? Like Google. But I think we can, if you join this movement, there is you will find a much more meaningful application of your skills. So I think this is what when I talk to people in those large companies, they are often well paid, but quickly find their job not as meaningful as they thought it would be. And so here you can really contribute to an economy that really lifts up much more to what an economy should really be for, which is serving people. Right? Serving people, and not just the needs of developers, but really the needs, of the people who most urgently require them. So to really build things that are needed, that can really change the economy to become a more fair place to work.
So a different model of ownership is possible, is already happening within today's market economy, and could be further enhanced by the benefits offered by digital platforms. Thank you so much for listening to today's session, and we look forward to seeing you again on the Diff. Remember to check that out at thinkdiff.co and by joining in the conversation at #ThinkDiff.